All right, we are back. Sorry about that. I had some resolution issues on my main monitor here, but we are going to be working through creating a little React application to help people become informed about how much they're going to get as part of their stimulus check, as part of the CARE Act here, in response to all the COVID-19 craziness that's happening. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to build this out using React.js in the Bootstrap front end framework. We're going to kind of dive in, and I think it's kind of a simple little application that we can build to kind of just get people excited and familiar with React and what React can do for front end applications. So as I was learning and reading about more of the things that are happening with coronavirus and COVID-19, I stumbled across this little form here, this little widget, and I said, oh, well, wouldn't it be cool to kind of recreate this and build this in React and kind of teach alongside and show people how to do it. So we're going to do exactly that over the next 60 to 90 minutes. We may not finish it completely, but I want to show you some of the cool things that we can do with Create React App to kind of make this. All right, so let's dive in. So we're going to be using the React.js library here. By the way, if you have any questions or have any issues, let me know in the chat. I'm here streaming over restream.io, so whether you're in Facebook or YouTube or Twitch, I can see you and give me a shout. But anyway, so what we're dealing with here is we're going to be working with the React.js JavaScript library to build the form to basically calculate what somebody's surplus or what is it, stimulus check is going to be. So based on the CARE Act, if you're a single person and you have an adjusted gross income of $50,000 with no children, you'll receive a $1,200 stimulus payment. Okay? What we want to do is we want to use React.js to basically emulate and kind of what this is, create React app to generate this. We don't typically recommend or use create React app in the course, but just given the speed and popularity of the library, we're going to go ahead and use it. But for the most part, if you're going to become a professional React developer, we really recommend against using Create React App because there's so. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and install it and get underway. The other tool that we're going to use is the Bootstrap web framework, and it basically allows us to create a what's known as a responsive web application. A responsive web application is going to basically look great on a mobile device, on a tablet, on a desktop, a small laptop screen, right? Most modern web applications are going to sort of adapt to all of the features that an individual browser has. That's why we call it responsive web design, right? It responds to the features, including the display resolution and the width of the browser window, right? So you can see even how the Bootstrap web application here, as we move down to a mobile size, the buttons get bigger and easier to click if you're on a mobile device, right? We're going to use the Bootstrap framework to kind of make all of that nice and easy. All right, so in order to get started, though, we've got to build out our code base. So we're going to use Create React App to make that happen. We're going to yarn global add Create React App. And then we're going to create React App, and we'll call this Stimulus Calculator. And when I run Create React App Stimulus Calculator, I'm basically telling Create React App to create me a new React code base in the folder called Stimulus Calculated with React App. All right, so go in and we'll go into the new root that we've created. We're going to yarn install again just to make sure we've got everything we need. The other thing that we're going to do is we're going to pull this up in our code editor. We really like Visual Studio Code, so we've got this up and running. And I'm going to create a new file called .env, and I'm just going to skip preflight check for now. This is just a goofy setting that Create React App requires us to do just to manage some of the underpinnings of what we're doing with React applications. So what's really neat is if I run yarn run start, I'm going to basically boot up my React application. It's going to open, and we can use that to basically start to realize our vision for this stimulus calculator that we want to build, right? So the first thing that we need to do actually is remove some of the cruft and some of the material that Create React App left behind. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove everything that they've added so we can kind of lay in our own groundwork to do our work, right? So there's some default cascading style sheets, CSS, that we want to get rid of, as well as this logo, for example, we want to get rid of as well. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to delete. Go ahead and delete these guys. Boom. Delete those. And then in our app.js, we're going to remove references to those two items. And then we'll also remove the CSS reference here. And what we should get now is hopefully a blank page. So what we want to make sure is we don't have any more references to external files, right? So we get rid of all that noise. And there we go. All right, and what we should have in our browser window is a blank page. One of the cool things about modern web frameworks like React is it uses a technology called hot module replacement. So when I make a change in my editor here, it's actually going to update real time once I save it in my browser. I no longer have to kind of hit save here and then go into my browser and hit the refresh button, right? So it's really nice, convenient functionality. Okay, so we kind of have our blank slate, which is wonderful. We're up to play code. So we're basically logging all the changes that we're making as we go, so we can kind of keep track of those changes using what's called a source code management tool. In this case, we're using Git. It's a very popular tool for doing so. And basically, as we go and make major sort of progress with the application, we're going to commit those changes. So there's sort of a history and a log of all the changes that we've made. All right. So we go in, and what we need to add next is Bootstrap as a framework for our responsive web design, right? So what we're going to actually use is Bootstrap React. We're going to yarn global add, not global, yarn add React Bootstrap and Bootstrap. And then we're going to actually import the SCSS into our application. So we're going to create a new SCSS folder or directory here. New folder, SCSS. We're going to create a new file. We're going to call it application.sss. And we'll import the Bootstrap library directly into our app, and then we'll need to import that actual file. Import SCSS application.scss. And if we've done our work right, we shouldn't get any errors. We should still get sort of our blank page. Cranky because we're using Sass for the first time. So what we need to do is we need to install support for Sass in order for Create React App to do its thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into a new tab here in our terminal, and we're going to go to our stimulus calculator. We're going to yarn add node Sass. We got to restart our server. And there we go. Go back to a blank page. So basically what we did is when we ran our yarn add Bootstrap React, we basically brought in all of the CSS and functionality that we get in using the Bootstrap framework. So now I can use all of the CSS rules that Bootstrap defines for us to basically make an aesthetically pleasing website, right? So what we're going to do is move in our app and start to build out our form, right? So we want to build out a form in a way that looks great in our mobile device and on our desktops and across our tablets, right? So we're going to look at some of the functionality that Bootstrap gives us with forms. You can see here that right out of the gates, the Bootstrap documentation walks us through what we can do to basically build our form. So we're going to do exactly that. In order to do so, we're going to build a new component. We'll put it in a new folder called calculator. And we'll create an index.js. And we'll call it index.jsx. And we're going to call this a calculator. We got to import React. Which we do. And then we are going to start to build out our form, basically. So in order to do so, we want to first kind of create our little container within our application so that the form is going to appropriately shrink and grow as part of our mobile design, right? So what we're going to need to take charge of is our layout. We go to the Bootstrap documentation, and you can see we create a container class. Then everything is going to shrink nicely, and we can take advantage of all of the nice responsive functionality inside the Bootstrap framework. So what we're going to do is create our container. We can actually just use the app container for that. And then we'll be ready to create our calculator. So we're going to import calculator from calculator. And there we go. So just to make sure that we are tying in our components here, if I just return an h1 tag, you can see that it shows up here on the screen, right? So basically our app.js is the beginning of where our whole React application lives. And we brought in the calculator component and we put it inside our app container div, right? And that's going to allow us to start to do our layout work inside the calculator. All right, so we probably want to say something like div class name equals column. I think is it call Bootstrap? What does Bootstrap want? It's row and then call. Yep. estimated. What do we want to call this? How much? Right. So what I've done is I've started to incorporate some CSS classes that the Bootstrap framework gives us, right? So basically, Bootstrap is going to make it easy for us to create wonderful experiences both on the desktop and on a mobile device, right? As we shrink our screen, we see the differences in the experience, right? So we're just starting with very humble beginnings, right? And what we're going to do is we're basically going to build out our form and get our form working in the way that we need it so that we can start to get the information from the user to make the calculation on the basis of how much they earned, right? So again, remember, what we're trying to do here is kind of reproduce this element so that we can ask a few basic questions of an end user and then return how much they're going to get back in their stimulus check. All right. So we're going to go into our Bootstrap documentation. We're going to learn more about our forms. See here, we've got a form group, and then we can create a series of elements, right? All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our form group. And we'll go ahead and looks like it wants a form group for every single one, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a form tag around the whole thing. And then we're ready to create our label. And we're going to basically emulate this this information, right? These are the questions that we want to ask the end user, right? So we're going to ask, oh, you know, what was your adjusted gross income? And what we'll see now is we'll see quite an ugly form, right? But we see the header that we added here in the component, and then we see the label and the input, right? And if we want to bind these two things together, we have to use a for element here. We have to use a substitute. React label for. For attribute. React label for attribute. There's an alias that we have to use. And it is HTML4. That's right. So in creating a label for the input, we're going to basically bind this text so that when I click on it, it's going to set focus on this input. So if we go here, we click on this now, see how there's blue highlight around that input element? That's what we want, right? All right. And we go back to the Bootstrap documentation. See how it wants us to format all this. Got our label, we've got our input. Okay, so we're ready to ask the user additional questions, right? We want to ask whether they're a single, married, or head of household. And we'll worry about cleaning up the formatting of this in just a minute. I'm wondering actually if Bootstrap is loading the way that it needs to. So we're going to do label HTML4. I think we'll ask for children next. Number of children under 17. Right, input type. When we're binding our labels to inputs, it's really important that our HTML4 and our ID match up. There's a couple of different ways that you can bind a label to an input, but here we're doing it with the HTML4 attribute and the ID attribute. So if we refresh our page, you'll see that now we've got number of children, a second input there with labels properly bound. Right? All right, so now we want to do sort of a, I think I like a radio button for this. Why don't we do radio buttons for this and see what Bootstrap has to offer for all of that. So, okay, so we're going to do form group row. Helps our range inputs. Then, okay, checkboxes and radios. We want this sort of nice stacked sort of setup here, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a form check div, and inside that we're going to create a set of labels, right? And what we want to do is we want to use the power of JavaScript here to basically abstract this out. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const filing options, I guess, and we'll call it single, married, or head of household. Right, and basically for each one of these, we're going to want to create a form check that is going to be bound to the same ID, right, and same name. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const filing option or filing radios, and we're going to say filing options dot map option, and we're going to return a div. We'll have to use the name as the key. And then in here, we're going to basically mimic what we have in the Bootstrap boilerplate here, right? So we can just take this and copy it. And we're going to obviously need to customize it to meet our needs, right? So we'll leave the form check input class, the type radio. We're going to change this to filing option. We'll call this filing option, and we'll need to put this in JSX for us to interpolate it. And here we're going to put in our option. Make sure everything closes nicely. We don't want this checked by default, right? Filing option. We want to keep all this consistent, and then we're going to turn this value into change this to option, change this to option. And then in here, we're going to use the option text as well. Let's see what this gives us. Hopefully no errors, and it doesn't. So now what we need to do is we need to take this list of filing option radio buttons. We need to put it into our React layout. We do so by just saying, just like so. And there we go. There's our radio buttons. Again, the form is kind of ugly, right? But we have some progress here in that we've provided some options, right? And we want to make sure that those labels work. So we're going to change this for be an HTML4, and we're going to use the same ID here. So const input ID. We take this value, put it up here. We have to put it outside the map. And we put it. All right, so now our ID of our radio button and our labels should correlate. So that's a really important thing for accessibility. The web is meant to be an accessible place. So if you're vision impaired, you want to have the ability to select these items through a browser that supports screen reading. And if we don't properly bind our labels, that's not going to be possible. It also enables somebody that is visually able to basically be able to click on these labels and actually have the radio button selected. So really important accessibility thing to make sure that you keep an eye on. All right, so we've got some of our elements here. I think we're actually ready to introduce our button. If we look again at our item here, we've got our income, our number of children, and our filing status, right? Starting to ask all those questions in our form here as well. One nice thing that we may want to do is rather than make this a text field, we can actually change that to be a number field. And see, now we get these nice little buttons. If you're in Chrome, kind of increment and decrement this number. Pretty neat and handy item. If we wanted to learn more about what we could do to restrict these values, what we could do is we could go to our favorite resource, MDN, and look up input type. Now, if I try to hit this down arrow again with a 0 value in here, I can't. All right. So now we're ready to add our button. And if we look at our Bootstrap documentation, let's look at buttons. And let's go ahead and just snag some of this markup. We throw it in here. We're actually going to make this a button type equals submit. And we're going to say calculate. And again, super ugly layout, right? But we've got our form as it should exist. Right? So let's try and clean this up a little bit layout-wise. We won't spend too much time on it, but you know, it kind of hurts to look at right now. So let's see what we can do to improve the aesthetics. So if we look at the Bootstrap documentation, and we look in our layout, look at our grids, basically it supplies us with ways to break out our rows into columns so that as we decrease the size of our window, it stacks nicely, right? So what this is saying here is we basically have 3 small columns, and for as long as the width will endure, we're going to try to keep everything into 3 columns. But once it hits a certain breakpoint, then we're going to see it break from 3 columns side to side to 3 vertically aligned elements. And that's the power of responsive web design kind of working for us here. All right, but what we want to do is we want to start looking at our forms and just make sure that we've got those set up properly. right? So we got our form group class names, hopefully. Class names, good. All right, and let's look at our laying out. So on a form group, we set a label. That all looks good to me. All right, so then in a form grid, we set a row and a column. So I think what we want to do is put the labels in their own column. And the inputs in their own column. So let's actually just temporarily remove some of our inputs here and see if that looks nice. Certainly looks better. We've got some work to do, but that'll look better once we get everything in here. All right, so we set a column. In here. We move our label inside a column, and then we move our input inside a column as well. And then, thanks to the power of JavaScript, right, we only have to update our radios one way. And what we're going to actually do is just throw these in a column. So that they show up directly under the inputs. All right. And then in here, we can just throw our button into an individual column. And then we should have a much prettier form, hopefully. Well, pretty is a relative term. But you can see how it is basically reacting to the width of the browser. And we're going to kind of optimize for right now for the mobile device. So we'll keep this at a nice kind of svelte width here. All right. So right now, right, we can input all this data, but we can't really do anything with it, right? And the power of React is that we want to be able to basically respond to events. So we want the user to be able to input all their information, and we want to spit out a calculation, right? So what we're going to do is commit our progress thus far. Display a very unrefined form, right? All right. So we do that. And we are ready to start binding state to our elements. So what we want to do React-wise is whenever there's a change in state, we want that change to basically be stored locally in React. And in order to do that, we have to make our component here, our calculator, stateful. And with React 16, we can do so using some new functionality known as useState. And what we're going to basically store is all of the data that the user provided. So we can say, what are we going to call this? Stimulus info. I don't really like that. I'm not really in love with the idea of form data. One of the hardest things to do in programming is naming things. So what are we going to name this thing? So this would be calculator inputs. We're going to basically start with a blank object. That blank object is going to have some stubs for some of our properties, right? So the first thing that we're going to say is that income is going to be blank, and number of children is going to be blank. And then also our filing option is blank. So we're basically just initializing all these values so that we can later populate them when the forms change. So what we need to do is we need to introduce a change handler that's going to basically update these values every time the user makes a change to those form inputs, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to define a form change function here. Const on input change equals, and in here we're going to want to call set calculator inputs, and we're going to basically take the current target and take its name, and we're going to set it to event.currentTarget.value. I think I need to call attributes.name. And basically, every time one of our inputs change, we want to take that information and populate it using this set calculator inputs item here, right? So this is basically going to store all this information temporarily for us so that when we submit the form, we can basically send it to a function, have the function crunch the math, and give us a result. Right? So what we do here is we go ahead and we bind this to our input. To a change. All right, so let's see what happens now that I've bound this event handler when I update my income value. In order to do this and to work with this, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to also make sure that you've got React developer tools installed. Very, very handy set of components that allow us in Chrome developer tools to basically look inward on some of our React components when we're actively developing them. So if I go ahead and I inspect this element, I can go then to the Components tab, and I can see that all of my state that I just programmed is kind of hooked in to this calculator component, right? And then hopefully as I change this value, my value here is undefined. I think that's because I've got the wrong setting here. So let's go ahead and throw in a debugger. And what we want to look at is we want to look at how to get the name of our input, right? So event.currentTarget.attributes, I think it's get attribute value, get attribute, event.get attribute, that should work. Event.currentTarget is my input. Oh, I didn't set a name on it. I must set a name on it. That's why it's returning null. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to say name equals income. And the name field is going to be important for our radio buttons, because if you remember, in our radio buttons, we had to set a distinct ID, right? One of the rules of HTML is that you can only have an ID for every HTML page. It must be unique to the page. So if I had multiple radio buttons that had the same ID, I'd have invalid markup. I'd have the invalid HTML, and that would cause us problems, right? So the way that we're going to group these together is by their name attribute, and that's going to allow us to perform our calculation. All right, so we go in here, we look at on input change, we're setting our name field. So we should be able to then call here, let's just call dot get attribute. Then I think it might be value. Well, we'll find out once we hit the debugger. Slowing down my machine. While we're waiting for this to refresh, if you're still with me, give me a shout in the chat, whether you're on Facebook Live listening in or in YouTube. Is this helpful? Is this showing you something about React that you didn't know or understand? Let me know what's happening, and let me know if I can be moving slower or faster through some of this stuff as you are sort of listening along. What's going on? Let's restart our server. Sometimes the debugger gets cranky, so open up a new tab. There we go. Invalid DOM property class. Where do I have a class? Can't have class in a React component. We have to instead use a class name, like so. We've got it elsewhere. Get rid of that. Should just have class names all the way down, which we do now. Okay, so we're no longer getting any errors. Go ahead and we change this, sparking our debugger. All right, so now basically in our debugger, we've paused time, right? We can kind of look in here and see the state of our program, including being able to look at the event object and then being able to say current target, which is representative of the input element that we're dealing with, right? We can say attribute right? So that would give us what we need. However, it's not super defensive, so that's why we'll use the get attribute method here, and you can see that it's going to return the value that we want, right? So I can get rid of my debugger, and that's going to work just perfectly for us. In here, we want to use the get attribute name. So basically, as these inputs change, we're going to update these values in state, right? So we need to add our change handler in our number of children as well. So we're going to say on change equals on input change, just like so. We can get rid of that debugger, which I think we've done. We save and we refresh. And the debugger just getting cranky, so we restart our tab here. All right. So now, as I update our elements in here, right, and granted, that's probably a crazy maximum, right? But what we should see in our React debugging tools here, we should see that all of those, that information is retained, right? So as I update my input values in the form, we're going to see those changes reflected in the React state. Right? So this is what we know as creating a stateful component, a controlled component that basically is going to allow us to keep track of what the user is entering in the form, right? So we've done that for our number of children and our adjusted gross income. Now, what do we do with these radio buttons? And radio buttons are a little tricky because we can't use the on-change handler. We want to think of something different, right? What can we use that's different? Well, I think we want to use the on-selected input event, but let's look at MDN and just make sure. Input type. One thing that I think is really kind of new for newcomers to programming is that you see me constantly just referring to the documentation, right? I have a framework in my head of what a radio button can do and everything that I want to do in terms of binding the event. But I always like to confirm my understanding, and especially when you're on a fast internet connection and you've got a resource at your fingertips, it's always good to sort of just make sure and be confident. And there's no point deductions for looking it up and using your resources. So go ahead and do that, right? So let's look at some of the event handlers. So got here submit event, blah, blah, blah. Using radio buttons, styling. So actually the documentation is not really super helpful for us here. Checked on selected. What do we want to do? I think what is React like? React radio button event handler. Let's make sure. Checked, okay. So the checked attribute is going to designate whether it's selected or not, right? So we can use that, which we will. And what about firing an event to trigger a state change? That's what I want. Yeah, on change. Okay. And we're going to on it. So now if we update our gross income to say 50,000 and our number of children to 2, and we say that we're married, we should see all of that reflected here in our React state. And it looks like we actually have a bug, right? So our number of children input isn't appropriately setting our name. We probably forgot to set the name attribute, right? We go in here, we look at our income, we've got our name attribute, but if we look at our number of children, we have the ID set, but we don't have the name attribute set. So we go ahead and do that, refresh our page. We don't want commas. Get those commas out of here. Okay. And if we look at our state again, now we can see that we've got a completed form. So what we've done is we've used React State to create controlled components so that all the information that the user inputs is tracked by React. We see that here using the React toolbar. Now, what is going to be neat is we can take all this information, and when we hit the calculate button, we're going to spit out a result. Let's see who we have here on with the switch. Got about a few folks here. I will go onward with the calculation, and we'll work on cleaning up the form a little bit later. All right, cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to commit our progress, bind state to the form elements. And then what we want to start doing is we want to start having the calculation start to fire events, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to bind an event to the onSubmit of the form. So onSubmit equals handle, well, to be consistent with what we did here on calculation submit. we're going to create a new event handler, const on calculation submit. And the very first thing that we need to do as part of the submit handler is, by default, a browser is going to try to submit this. We want to prevent that behavior because we're going to do all of that logic on the front end. We're going to use React in JavaScript to perform our calculation. Values equals calculator inputs, right? This value is accessible on the basis of how we've enclosed this function. Right? So I'm going to be able to access that variable. And this variable is going to reference what's in state, what the user has provided through the form input, right? So now if I go ahead and I refresh my page, just for good measure, put in the values 50,000, 1 married, I hit calculate. See, I get into my debugger here, and I can look at values, and you can see I get my JSON object of all of the data that we need to make our calculation, right? And basically, the Fed and the government powers that be have basically created a formula to determine how much each person is going to get, or each household is going to get in CARE Act stimulus, right? And these are the inputs. And it would be really tempting for us to go ahead and just start performing the calculation in the formula here in my component. But that's a violation of good design, right? We want to separate that logic into its own function and make that easily testable, right? In doing so, we're going to basically create the opportunity for unit testing and basically making sure that the component works the way we expect. Right here, I'll define a stimulus calculation. And this is just going to be a plain JavaScript function. There's a lot of talk right now in the JavaScript and React community about how functional we should get in our approach, right? If you've done some object-oriented programming in the past, normally what we do here is we create a JavaScript class, a constructor, and a bunch of functions to basically perform the calculation. But for today, I'm feeling particularly functional, so we're going to create a function to actually perform the calculation. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a, I like to name my functions verbs. So we're going to say calculate. Wow, stimulus is a weird word to type. All right, so calculate stimulus, and we're going to receive 3 inputs here, right? We're going to receive all of the values that were passed in by the component. So values, income, number of children, and filing options. Get rid of all the defaults because these are going to be required parameters. All right. Get rid of those unnecessary parens. Put them around our argument list. And we got to export default, calculate stimulus. Then we want our component to be able to use that function. Right? And then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to write unit tests to basically exercise this functionality, right? So there's a set of rules that the Fed has defined that we're going to basically implement in this little function, right? So in order to do that well, I think we should use a couple of examples, write some automated tests, watch those tests fail, and then write functionality to basically make those tests pass. And thankfully, create React app. If you remember, that's what we created this React application with. So let's start. We're going to create a folder. This is the convention that Jest likes us to use. And inside here, we're just going to start describing the behaviors of calculate stimulus. We're going to import the function itself. And basically what we're going to do, the whole sort of benefit of unit testing is we're going to come up with a bunch of examples and then make sure that the calculation comes back the way that we expect, right? So we say basically, let's look for some samples, right? If you earn 74,000, you'll receive $1,200, right? So basically, if you're single and you earn $74,000, you're going to get a $1,200 stimulus check. Let's start really simple, right? Awards. For no children, we're going to say $74,000 earner, right? So this is kind of our simplest use case. So what we're going to do is we're going to call calculate stimulus, and we're going to call it with an income of 74,000. We're going to say filing option is going to be single, and we're going to say that number of children is 0. Right? And we just get the result. And here we say we expect result to equal $1,200, right? So this is our very first test. And what we can do is we can run this test. And it's going to fail, right? And the reason why it's going to fail is we haven't actually implemented this function. We haven't done any work in here, right? So we can be kind of goofy, right, and hard code our value and get our test to pass. Let me see if I can straighten out these videos a little bit. Right? But we know we want to build in business rules. Well, the rules of TDD and sort of if we're practicing strict test-driven development, what we're going to do is we're going to come up with another use case. Calculates 0. Well, I don't know if it's 0. Well, let's do 0 for a single, no children, I don't know, $200,000 earner. Right? So now we have to introduce some logic into our function. So we say const result, take all this information. We're going to change this value to 200,000, right? Keep the person single and keep the number of children 0, and we expect that the result is going to be 0, right? Now, if you remember, we hard-coded the value 1200 in our function, right? So as a result, this test is going to fail. So what we can do is we can continue to write test cases that are going to require us to get more complex with our logic, right? We're going to start to write a little bit of logic here, right? So what this says is individuals will receive up to 1200. So there are income restrictions. If you earn more than 75,000 as an individual, the total amount you're eligible to receive starts to decrease. If you earn 99,000 or more as an individual, you aren't eligible to receive a stimulus check. Wow. Okay. So what that means is individual max is 99,000, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to extract that out as a constant and say individual max is going to be max income is going to be 99,000, right? We're going to say, okay, well, hey, if your income is greater than individual max income, well, then you get nothing. Otherwise, you get 1200. And in doing it this way, now both of our tests pass. All right. Now, as you know, right, we are only considering 2 use cases here. So if we want to do more work, we got to start to play around with the values that we're sending to the calculator. So what about somebody that's or a household that's married and earns $100,000? Well, married $100,000 as a couple, then that means that you're going to get $2,400. Right? So it calculates $2,400 for a married, no children, $100,000 earner. Right? So this is why I love test-driven development. Right? It's so easy to just come up with use cases to make our logic increasingly complex, right? And what's nice is as I introduce new use cases or new possibilities, I have all the old cases that I still have to satisfy, right? So it's a way of kind of keeping us honest as a developer to make sure that we're writing really great code, right? So we're going to take this, we're going to plug it in here, and we're going to say, okay, well, what if we're married and we earn a combined income of $100,000? We expect to actually get $2,400 back. And of course, this is going to fail because we're not considering the married versus single use case, right? So we need to first say, well, hey, wait a minute. Is your filing option equal to single? If so, then we're going to use this breakdown. Otherwise, we're going to have to come up with a whole new set of calculations, right? So here we're going to say, well, wait a minute, is your income greater than your, let's just call it joint max income? According to this, if you earn $198,000 as a couple, you aren't able to receive a stimulus check. All right. So what we do is we basically say if the income is greater than your joint max income, well, then you get nothing. Otherwise, you get $2,400. What did I do? Filing option, not file option. Pass. Right? So really, to build out our calculation logic, all we have to do is come up with more use cases and play around with the knobs and dials to basically get our calculation. Let's do our child credit. I'm not going to worry too much about the special cases just because we're running up short on time. But basically, we could continue to get more complex with these use cases because I think there are some special rules. For example, if you start earning $76,000 as an individual, then you start to lose $100 of the surplus, right? So maybe we'll implement that in a separate session. But what I do want to do is make sure that we account for the number of children. So individuals will receive up to $1,200. Married couples will get $2,400, and $500 will be added for every child. Wait a minute, what does that mean? If I'm single and I make $50,000 and I have 2 children, what do I should get $2,200. Good. So $500 for each child. So we say our child bonus equals $500, right? So we're going to need to basically start to use some variables to basically house some of this logic, right? So we're going to say that we need a let starting stimulus equal, well, we don't really need to assign it anywhere. And we're going to and then we need to return that value. And that should make all of our tests pass. But now we need to introduce a new test, right? We need to say, well, hey, if you have 2 children, or a single with 2 children, and you earn $7,400. Right? So we go ahead and we say calculate for a $74,000 earner. If you're single, we expect the result to equal $2,200. Now, obviously, this is going to fail because we haven't accounted for the child bonus, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take the number of children and add $500 for each child. And we should get 2,200, but we received 1,200. Well, let's see if we changed our knobs and dials appropriately. Nope, we didn't. We have to change our number of children to 2. And there we go. It passes. All right. So that's kind of good enough for now. And obviously, this is a very rudimentary calculation. We have more logic that we can introduce here. And I can TDD through that maybe tomorrow or another day. But we have enough of a function here to start actually showing the result, right? So let's go ahead and commit this. Implement a rudimentary calculator. And now we're going to actually start to use this function in the context of our React component, right? So we go into our React component. And basically, what we can say is const stimulus amount equals calculate stimulus with all of our calculator inputs, right? And if we've done our work well, we could even just show an alert box that's going to show us the amount of money that we're going to get as part of our stimulus. We may need to restart our server here. It says module not found. Can't resolve calculate stimulus in our calculator. Right? So we've got our calculate stimulus function. Calculate stimulus. We've got to export default. So we're exporting that in. I think we've got to do it that way. It's got to go in lib. So we had a bad path in importing our function. All right. We go in here. We say 50,000, no children, we're single. We should get a $1,200 bonus. And we do. We see that in the alert box, right? So you can see the power of extracting out that function to its own object, right? Or to its own function in this case, right? So in doing so, we have a nice sort of clean isolation of all of our calculation logic, and it makes it super testable so that we can test all the edge cases and corner cases later, right? So now we have that value. Now we can actually start to use it in the context of our React component, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go in and we're going to store this information in state. So instead of storing it in a constant, we're going to store it in a new piece of state called set stimulus amount. And we're going to use a new piece of state for this. And we're going to default it to null, All right, so now when we run our calculation, it's going to be set here, right? And then we can use the getter as part of this use state hook to basically put that inside of our React component. So what we're going to do above our return is we're going to say, hey, wait a minute, if we have a stimulus amount, we're going to have a panel and we're going to say stimulus panel equals div class name equals panel, I think is the Bootstrap convention, and we're going to say stimulus amount. Put a $sign in front of it. Right. All right, so now we have this stimulus panel, not panel, pane, but panel, that we can inject at the bottom of our layout, right? So I want this in a column actually next to and we're just gonna put it like so, stimulus panel, and we're gonna actually do our management of the grid up here. So div class name equals column. Yeah, that's what we want. All right, so no more alert. And when we go ahead and we fill out all this data, let's say we have 2 children. We gotta actually interpolate that data. Let's try it again. 50,000, 2 children, single, and there it is. We get our value. Now, notice how that kind of jumped around. That wasn't a great experience, right? So what we want to do is, first thing, we want to move our H1 probably in its own row. Then we will have to put this whole thing in a fragment because you can only have one parent element in a React component. All right. And what we want to do, so now see our form is kind of on its own line. So when I calculate my value, see how this no longer lines up with the headline, but it lines up with the form. So that's great. But what we want to be able to do is we don't want that kind of janky behavior of the form moving over when I hit the calculate button. We want to anticipate that div is going to show up, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to set an explicit size on our column here, and we'll call it call large 4. I think that's the way Bootstrap likes it. Yeah, maybe we'll make it call large 5. There we go. Okay, so that looks pretty good on a wide browser, right? So now when I enter in all this information, everything will stay fixed, right? That looks reasonably well, right? We want to use the Bootstrap sort of panel Jumbotron, is it called now? No, they have panels. They call it card. No, I don't like card. What do they have? Badge, alerts, navbar. No, I don't like any of these. What do we got? Ghosts. No, I don't like the toast. What do we want to use here? Yes, Jumbotron. I don't really like Jumbotron. Alerts. There used to be little panels that I could use. What do we want to use here? I think I can just use... What are Jumbotrons intended for? A lightweight, flexible that can extend the entire viewport to showcase key marketing messages. Nope, don't want that. No, we don't want a modal. Just create an alert. Sure, why not? Alert primary. Let's make it. Yeah, that works. Let's do that. So we go ahead and we make this panel alert primary. And let's see how that impacts. Kind of ugly, but we can do quite a bit of cleanup in subsequent revisions, right? But as we calculate values, we can move things around. We haven't really handled for a head of household in terms of, well, married and head of household will function, I believe, the same way, right? We see as we change values, the expected surplus, the expected stimulus check value changes, right? So if I have 0, we don't get anything. We should probably change that. So, in our conditional, if stimulus amount, so 0 is a falsy value. So when it's 0, it's basically hiding our component, right? So what we want to say here is if stimulus amount does not equal null. So now if I do 50,000, 0, I'm single. Well, now I want to do, what, 78,000? No, I think it was 99,000, right? You'll see, you'll likely get nothing, right? So a nifty little example. It took us, about an hour and a half to create a really meaningful front-end application using React.js. And we were also able to demonstrate the power of test-driven development and how we can extract logic from our components and make very readable functions that are also very testable, right? So in a subsequent session, I can both improve these tests and make our calculator a little bit more robust and a little bit more complex, right? The other thing that we will run into is, well, what happens if I forget to enter in our adjusted gross income or our number of children, right? The calculation is going to not be accurate. So what we need to do is we also need to add in some validation to make sure that the user entered everything that they need to in order for us to perform our calculation. So I think that's a good way to kind of close us out for this evening. I hope that this was useful and fruitful for you. If you wouldn't mind just giving me some feedback in the comments, giving us a like if you're on Facebook, or a subscribe if you're on YouTube. I'm hoping that we're going to start to do a lot more of this live streaming and education while we're all sequestered to our homes. And I hope that this was useful, fruitful, and exciting, inspiring for you. You can do this stuff. So everything that I taught you here in this very quick and hand-wavy implementation, we teach in weeks 3 and 4 of our on-campus and online curriculum. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can go to launchacademy.com, sign up for our email list, and also sign up for an informational call. Thanks so much for hanging out with me, and I look forward to seeing you in a future stream.